train here. It's gonna continue. So today, our practice is around a pose called Samakonasana, which is same or equal angled pose. Konasana is angled. We have side angle like Parshva. Konasana is side angle. Samakonasana just means that the legs are in center splits, which is a really challenging posture, and ultimately we're going to do our best with it. It's not an easy endeavor, and I'll personally say that I've had multiple injuries when I was younger from doing this as a young, I guess, martial artist. I was into doing splits because I did Taekwondo, and there's a lot of big straddles. And not really understanding the body at a young age, I would do splits between chairs, and I never really thought about injuring myself. And then I did at probably when I was in 4th or 5th grade or so. I remember the first time having a deep pain in my groin area, and my father told me it was a pulled groin. And at that age, it's kind of rare to have such an injury, but it became persistent. And then I moved completely away from all sort of flexibility as I got into middle school, and then did sports like hockey and such. And I stopped doing anything flexibility-wise, not really on purpose or anything like that, but I became super tight, and all that pain of the being overly flexible went away, lucky for me. So I'm just checking here because I'm frozen according to, okay, we're good. My video was frozen a little bit, my monitor. As I moved into my older ages and became less and less flexible, eventually I came to yoga in my early 20s, and that's where I started working on flexibility again. Not necessarily on purpose, wasn't my goal of yoga at that time. It was just really to get to know my body. But a lot of the poses, as you know, demand a certain level of flexibility, and Samakonasana is no stranger to that. It requires a tremendous amount of flexibility in the inner adductors and hamstrings. And as I was just kind of on the journey of learning this posture, I started to kind of feel that I was on the verge of injuring myself again, like little mini injuries here and there. And so I had to come at it at a different approach. I decided that I was going to build muscle integrity instead, meaning strength of the muscle regardless of whatever length that these muscle groups were at. So even if my legs were out wide, I was able to contract back in. That was my goal, to be able to be strong enough to hold the legs inward. And now I never go to my full end range. I never go to my fullest range of flexibility just to avoid the injury. It's not worth it for me. So just so you're aware that that's my path with this posture. And I would encourage you to do something similar. Never go to the end range of any posture for that matter. Never go to your fullest flexibility. Always stay back a little bit, because then you don't run such a high risk of injury. When we go into that, fullest extent of our flexibility, that's where injuries can happen really quickly and easily. All right, so let's get started. And I'm having just some issues. You're all, if you can let me know in the chat, just let me know that everything's okay on your end. I'm still seeing that things are kind of stalling in my monitor, but it does say excellent connection. So hopefully it's not the same scenario for you. Just give me a quick thumbs up if everything's coming in okay, and we'll get started. All good for you? Cool, thanks Ani, I appreciate that. I'm glad to hear that. And if I get a few more confirms, then we will begin. Just want to make sure before we begin, I'm not going to be teaching to the internet space. It's good for you too, Lenore. Okay, great. Well, I'm going to ignore this little monitor here, and I'll just keep an eye on the chat in case something goes wrong. Y'all can let me know. Okay, perfect for you all. Okay, cool. Thank you, everybody. That's good. We're good on the confirms. Let's get started. Let's begin in child's pose. So what we're going to be working with today, again, is the adduction of the thighs that we did in class number 1, but also understanding how to manipulate the pelvis and I guess activate the external and internal rotators. So we're going to be putting a number of things together. This is a challenging posture, and that means it includes more than one simple technique typically. At least that's what I qualify as a challenge, is that it requires coordination of different muscular engagements and joint actions in order to have greater access to it. So let's start in wide-kneed child's pose, and let's remember or remind ourselves what or where the adductors are and how to activate them. So knees wide, arms out in front. And just in case you forgot, the adductors are the muscles along the inner thighs that run all the way up to your inner groins. And what these muscles do is they draw the legs in towards the midline. They'll also help to internally rotate the thigh bones. They'll also help to stabilize the pelvis in our everyday life. So let's activate them. And in order to do so, I suggest lifting the hips just a little bit, like get them light away from the ground so they're not so heavy on your heels. And then just start to squeeze your knees toward each other. Doesn't have to be crazy amounts, just enough that you're going to feel your inner thighs active. Maybe a little shaking is good. So your muscles trying to engage. And the muscles will struggle to engage the further or the greater length, meaning the more flexibility, the more you are in your flexibility, your range, the harder it is to engage them. Okay, and we're just going to slowly build strength through range of motion. Okay. Come to all fours, hands and knees on the in-breath. Let's arch the back and look up. As you exhale, round the back. Hey Tara, welcome in. Inhale, arch and look up. And exhale, round. Inhale, arch and look up. Exhale, round. Inhale, arch and look up. Exhale. Inhale, arch, look up. And downward facing dog. Let's take a full breath in. And a full breath out. Bend your knees a little bit and push with your arms so that your hips go up and back. And as you push the ground away so your hips go up and back, start to press the backs of your hamstrings away from one another like we did last class. I think it was. Which class was that? Where we activated the abductor muscles, but really more internally rotating the thighs. So you're pressing the backs of the legs apart. And while you're doing that, the fronts of the thighs should kind of face slightly more in towards the midline of the body, more towards each other, but not tremendous amounts. It's more of an isometric engagement than a movement. So just think about turning the fronts of the legs in while you push the backs of the legs apart. That should give you a little bit more range of motion. Probably feels like a deeper stretch in the hamstrings. Let's take a full breath in and out. Come forward to plank pose. And pause here. Let's remember the adductor muscles. So
lift your sit bones just a little bit, so a gentle arch in the lower back, sorry. The upper back should be rounded and full. A little arch in the low back. And now with that, squeeze the fronts of your shins in toward one another. So your inner thighs are fully active here, okay? Place the knees down on the ground and let's grab a block. We're gonna make this even more exciting. Take the block right between your thighs. So you kind of see the block is, I don't know, long ways through the thighs. And I know some of you, when you were younger, you had that candy called Pez. If you didn't, don't really worry about this so much. But if you, like a Pez dispenser would push the Pez back behind, like you open it up and push it out. Same thing, you're gonna like dispense the Pez back behind you. Don't worry about the analogy if you don't get it. You just kind of push the block back. So right now, see how if I tuck the tailbone, you see the block comes forward. If I anterior tilt, the block goes back behind me, but it's also an internal rotation of the thighs when the block goes back behind me. Okay, so you're gonna internally rotate and squeeze the block in a moment when we come up to plank. So come to all fours. I'm trying to give you a better angle. This might be better. Yeah, this is gonna be better. So let me just see if I can get, you can see fully in the block here. Okay, so if I tuck the tail, the block goes forward. If I anterior tilt, the block goes back. And you're gonna do a combination of anterior tilt and turning the thighs in. Take your feet about hip width apart, come up to plank pose. Okay, and in plank pose, start by squeezing the block. Okay, with the block squeezed, lift the block up with your thighs. So squeeze the block and try to dispense the Pez up to the sky. So you turn your thighs in and lift the sit bones up, lift the block up. And this, if you're squeezing the block and trying to internally rotate, meaning you're trying to press the pelvis up to the sky and turn the thighs inward, you're gonna feel your inner thighs and probably your outer hips as well if you're internally rotating. Okay, and place the knees back down. Now, of course, that was an exaggeration of the whole thing. And the exaggeration is just helpful for us to understand the action, and then we can slowly adjust how much we're doing, of course, along the way. Now we're gonna do just kind of like an interesting version of plank on knees. Round the back. I think some people call it bear pose or something like this. Squeeze the block and lift the knees up, but keep the knees bent. Okay, now turn the thighs in and move the block back like so. Keep the arch of the low back like this. Rounding of the upper back, separating the shoulder blades. Okay, and then release. Yes, holy TFL indeed. I'm glad you're feeling it, Patrick. Okay, give your hands a break for a moment. You can just stretch your shoulders. So we're gonna do this same block drill in downward facing dog. TFL is a big muscle, or a strong muscle that requires a tremendous amount of awareness you'll see in these wide-legged forward folds, these splits. So it will help you to tip your pelvis in certain ways. It's gonna be a great experience if we can get there with awareness. I don't know if I'm the only OCD one, but if my mat is not in line with the lines of the ground, it bothers me. Okay, we move the hips back. Turn the thighs in, feet apart, about hip width apart, and your low back in an arch. Now squeeze the block isometrically, so well, just kind of give it a big squeeze with a hug with your legs. And then as you lift your knees up, spin the thighs in, so you're both squeezing the block, but also trying to push it back between your legs. This is harder in down dog, because your hamstrings are going to fight you from doing that action. Squeeze the block and then press the inner thighs back. Try to push the block back with your legs, and that should get your hip flexors to really activate if you squeeze and press the inner thighs to the back behind you. Okay, and then place the knees back down. That should do it. Let's give our hands a break. So just from all fours, you can step your right foot forward. Tuck the back toes and come on up with the back leg. Let's activate the right glute muscles. Now, over the course of the last few classes, we've gone over each of these. So if you missed anything, if you missed any of the classes, be sure you do go back so that you're not lost as to where we are. Of course, continue this practice, but afterwards, then make sure you do the other practices as well. My suggestion is we spin the back thigh bone inward. So instead of, look at this back leg here, instead of kind of letting it roll out, spin it in and lift the back inner thigh up to the sky. That's gonna be internal rotation of the back leg. Now, scoop the tail and press through your front heel. Place your hands on your front thigh. Okay, get strong, get light. Let's manipulate the pelvis here so we start to understand anterior, posterior tilt of the pelvis. Starting in an anterior tilt, lift your bum up to the sky. It's like an arch of the back, so the chest has to lift as well. Your spine has to be in an extension in the low back. Now, switch it up. Posterior tilt the pelvis, scoop the tailbone, and firm the back leg once you're there. Let's do it with our breath. Inhale, anterior tilt. Straighten the inner leg to the sky. Exhale, posterior tilt. If you bend the back knee during the movement, that's okay. Just re-straighten it at the end. Inhale, anterior tilt. Those of you that are professional, then just keep the legs straight in the back the whole time. Those of you that are new to this action, it's good to bend the knee through the movement because you'll find you'll have more range of motion. So it's about what's appropriate to you and where you're at, not a right or wrong kind of thing or a better and worse sort of thing. Better is to do the action that challenges you enough where you have to build strength and awareness. And so that just depends upon where you're at. Okay, inhale, reach the arms to the sky. Exhale, hands to the ground. Straighten through the front leg. It should feel nice now. Exhale, bow. Inhale here. Exhale here. Bend the front knee. Exhale to all fours. Let's take an inhale, arch the back. Exhale, round. Inhale, arch. Step the right foot forward. Up on the fingertips. Strong in the back leg. So, back leg strong by pressing the inner thigh up to the sky. Round the upper back and press down through the front heel. Real quick, let's remember what the inner thigh activation feels like here. Just squeeze the two shins to the midline. Again, the midline divides your body from right to left. It's the center line between the two sides. As you squeeze in, it also the midline of the yoga mat, right? If you squeeze your right foot towards the left, your left foot towards the right. But try not to collapse your knees when you do that. Just squeeze inward without movement. And what's cool about that is if you squeeze in and the knees don't move, that means you're activating the outer hip muscles in order to stop movement. So that means more than just the adductors are engaging when you do that action. Okay, place the hands on the front knee. Firm up the back leg strong. Press your left heel down. I'd like you to do that in order to get your left glute muscles fired up. And then start to unwind the pelvis into anterior tilt. Let's take a breath in here. Keep the arch of the low back. Exhale, posterior tilt. Inhale, anterior tilt. Exhale, posterior tilt. Make sure you don't open your pelvis up when you do that, your right hip. Keep it closed. Inhale, anterior tilt. Exhale, posterior tilt. Inhale, anterior tilt. Exhale, posterior tilt. All right, inhale, reach the arms to the sky.
Exhale, hands to the ground.
All fours, right knee comes down. Oh, sorry, don't do that yet. Straighten through both legs. I always miss the hamstring stretch on the left side. Exhale, bow forward. Hold here. All right, and for the sake of time, let's step forward on the inhale, half lift. And pause. Grab your block. I have like 3/4 size blocks, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna grab 2 blocks. You can do the same if you've got 3/4. Okay, and with the blocks between your thighs, squeeze inward, and then try to, let's bend the knees for a second. Squeeze inward so you get your adductors active, and then press the inner thighs back behind you. You might have to lift your heels up for a second in order to allow, right? So when my heels come up, it gives me a little bit of ability to actually internally rotate the legs without getting the knees kind of caught in the action. Okay, so there it is. Squeezing the block with the inner thighs pressing back. And you can think at the inner knee, if anybody's compressing there, you can think inner knee kind of pulls forward and the shins actually kind of rotate outward the other direction of the thighs. And that'll give you kind of some oppositional space in the knee joint, making sure that you're not putting the pressure in the inner knees. Okay, so here we are. Inner thighs pressing back. And lean forward from the side angle. It's not back here, right? It's here. And you see I'm keeping my chest lifted right now, especially in this pose, because the back muscles in Samakonasana, the wide-angled or straddle position, that centered split position, requires tremendous amount of back muscles to fight the tension of your hamstrings, buttocks, and inner thighs. Your back muscles are actually what need to strengthen. So we sit here for a moment and use the strength of our back muscles to help anterior tilt the pelvis. That's essentially what we're going to be doing in the end of this class as well, but just on the ground. Okay, now let's take the hands to the hips. Arch the back, rise all the way up to stand. And you might feel that across the upper band of your buttocks as well. That's quite normal. So with the blocks between your legs, again, we want the blocks to go back. So as a result, the inner thighs are going to move back. Your pelvis goes more into anterior tilt. But just to make, I'm going to move my hands so you can see my hips move more, just to make sure everyone has, it's hard to feel an action unless you feel its opposite. So my suggestion is let's go tuck the tail and press the blocks forward, and then anterior tilt and move the blocks back. Now, the only reason this is actually anterior tilt is because my chest didn't move. If my chest came back as well with me, then I'd just be standing, okay? But most of us, when we posterior tilt, we're in our more natural not meaning good, natural just meaning our patterned state. That means our chest and everything is counterbalancing according to that position. So tuck tailbone, hips forward. It's not everybody, by the way, but it's a lot of people. And then if you do the opposite, move your inner thighs back, but your chest didn't move, your chest will be counterbalancing a little bit. So you're gonna move your chest back. In order to do that, at first, you're gonna have to push your heels out slightly. Now squeeze the blocks inward and find your adductor muscles. Okay, we're really gonna have to strengthen these adductor muscles today, especially if we want them to be more supple and ready for flexibility. Okay, so this is the goal for today, is to work the inner thighs back without necessarily, in the end, you're gonna see not necessarily turning the legs in, but just activating the internal rotators. In fact, we're gonna learn how to keep the thighs turned out eventually with activating the internal rotators. So bend your knees. And again, here's posterior tilt. Let's go back to anterior tilt. Push the blocks back behind you and sit low, or blocks, sorry. I'm sure not all of you have 2 blocks. And think about, you can grab the blocks for a second and you can kind of move them. So if you see that I move them back, I'm squeezing the blocks enough that when I push on them, let's see, what's a good angle for you? Yeah. When I push on them, it pushes the skin of my thighs back, giving me kind of a fascial feeling of sensation of what the movement is. So if you push the blocks back and you're holding on to the blocks, you're gonna feel your skin kind of rotate inward, and that's what we're doing, trying to do in our thigh bones and the bone structure, okay? That should be really exciting. Sit a little bit lower, take the arms out and up. Back muscles. Exhale, bow forward, and now we can finally remove these amazing structures between the legs. Inhale, halfway lift. Step the left foot back. Now imagine the blocks are between your legs here. Squeeze in side to side. Inhale, rise all the way up. Open up, warrior two. Okay, holding here for a few breaths, move the groins back. This is very important today. So the pelvis, instead of pressing it forward, moving it back. This is one way to help avoid more long-term injuries. When we press the pelvis forward, it puts pressure on the anterior capsules of the hip joints. So we move the groins back and you feel it softens up there. But your front knee will start to go in. So press your outer heel down and do external rotation of the front thigh. Rotate the thigh bone out while the groins are back. This is exactly the action that we're going to be doing in side angle, or sorry, an open wide angle. So your groins are going to be back and you're going to be keeping the thigh bone externally rotated. Now pull your feet toward each other. Arms out to the side. It's a very good preparation for, you can see this is very much, if I did this with both legs and straightened out the knees, we'd be in the pose. Inhale, reverse warrior. Exhale, hands to the ground. Plank pose, inhale. Imagine you have the block between your legs, squeeze in and lift the inner thighs up. Exhale, chaturanga. Slide hands and feet wide, fingertips. Inhale, peel the body up. Exhale, soften. Inhale, lengthen. Exhale, lower. All fours. Tuck the toes. Exhale, Adho Mukha Svanasana down dog. One breath in here. And a breath out. Right leg to the sky, inhale. Bend the knee, open up your hip, please. One breath in here. And breath out. Straight right leg, inhale, square hip. Step right foot forward. High lunge, rise, inhale. Warrior two, exhale. Groins back, hips back, but front thigh rotated out. Inhale, reverse. Side angle preparation, forearm to the thigh, hand to the hip. Again, especially for today, move the groins back, but spiral the front thigh externally. So spin the thigh bone out and press your outer right heel down. Okay, keeping that. Now the pelvis is gonna do the opposite. It's gonna do anterior tilt in order to get the right fingertips to the ground. Okay, so anterior tilt is tipping the front of the pelvis down towards the ground. Create a little bit of a back bend. That's one way of doing it. And turn the left chest open. Left hand to the sky. So I'm pressing the outer right heel down right now to spiral the right thigh bone out while I'm intentionally being more an anterior tilt today. So a little arc in the low back. And this will be a deeper stretch of the inner thighs if I do it in that fashion. If I could do more anterior tilt while my thigh bone is externally rotated outward. Still pressing the front outer heel down so my glutes are fired up. I'm not collapsed in the pose. One more breath. And release, hand to the ground. Pivot the back heel up. Let's go into another straight leg forward fold. Exhale, bow. We're going to enjoy a breath in and a breath out. Bend the front knee, step forward, half lift. Press the inner thighs back and hamstrings apart. Exhale, bow. Bend the knees, come to chair pose prep. Another way that we can feel is cross your arms and place the hands up at the inner thighs like so. And then literally try to press the flesh of your thighs back. It's just gonna speak a little bit to the fascia, and hopefully that intelligence of the fascial system and the nerves that innervate it will kind of understand, oh, okay, we wanna rotate inward. But at the same time, try not to let your knees collapse in with that. So you think what we're trying to get is the upper thigh bones to kind of rotate in, while the shins and the knees kind of stay exactly as they are. And it's subtle, the movement is subtle, but it takes a lot of kind of gross effort to kind of get there. Okay, once you've got that inner thighs rotating back and apart, you can then come on up, chair pose, inner thighs back and apart. Exhale, bow, Uttanasana. Halfway lift, inhale. Inner thighs back and hamstrings away from each other. Step the right foot back. Whenever I say inner thighs back and apart, that's inner rotation of the thigh bones, okay? Squeeze your legs in towards the midline and towards each other. Press down, rise, high lunge. And then open up Virabhadrasana 2. Steer the ship, steer the pelvis so that the hips and groins are back. And then again, the front knee will try to wing in. Press your left outer foot down and spiral the left thigh bone outward until you feel like there's a lever. You're rotating and pressing down through the outer heel. You're intentionally a little more anterior tilted today. So a little more butt back, groins back than a little more than normal. Okay, so you can feel your low back's in an arch position. But in contrast to that, you're really working, if you can, your left buttocks by spinning the left thigh bone out and pressing down through the left outer heel right below the ankle joint. Arms out to the sides. Groins back, left thigh rotating out. And staying for one more breath. Reverse warrior. Hands to the ground. Step to plank pose. Inner thighs up. Exhale, chaturanga. Hands and feet wide. Inhale. Exhale. Inhale, lengthen. Chest forward. Exhale, release. All fours. Exhale, down dog. Let's enjoy a breath in. Breath out. Left leg to the sky. Bend knee, open up the hip. Full breath in. Full breath out. Straight leg, square hip. Step. Rise. Exhale, open. Inhale, reverse. Side angle preparation. Again, let's sway the hips back. Now keeping the hips back, your left knee will kind of collapse in. So really it feels like the left buttocks tucks a little bit, and it sort of does, but it's more of a rotation of the thigh bone spinning out as you press your left outer heel down.
The pelvis, what it really does is more of like a little lateral tilt where you see the tailbone here. Instead of pointing backwards, it kind of comes under a little this way. Okay. Now, pressing the outer left heel back, keeping the groins back, intentionally anterior tilt a little more, so a little more back bend as you get your left hand to the ground. I can feel my left thighs or my left outer hip is weaker. It's tired already, but I just stay with it. I just keep pressing the outer left heel down. My intention is to get stronger. Okay, curl back, right hand to the sky. A lot of times we give up on when we feel challenged, but that's exactly the time to start. And we develop that mindset that our mind becomes more powerful than our weaknesses, whether it's physical or mental. And our intention and our deliberate action can accelerate us towards our potential. Potential in our physical body, potential in our mental body. Left outer heel presses down, groins back. Okay, and release. Again, we're gonna pivot the back heel up, and again on this side, we'll stretch left leg. Exhale and bow.
We're gonna hold this one just like we did on the other side. Okay, as you inhale, bend the knees, step forward. Exhale and bow forward, inner thighs back. Bend the knees, chair pose.
Inner thighs go back, hamstrings pull apart, reach the arms up, and hands to the hips, stand up. All right, so let's step wide on the yoga mat. Give me 1 second. Step wide, feet wide, toes turned out, toes turned out, Okay, toes turned out, bend the knees. And same idea like you just did, you're gonna move your groins back, chest forward. But as you do so, and this is really the key for today, is as you move the groins back, can you spin the thigh bones externally? So you can take your hands on your skin of your thighs and spin them outwards. So I pull the inner thighs up and rotate the legs back. Okay, keeping the legs externally is great, but now we want to fire up the adductors as well. So if you can't do anything but just like be here with anterior tilt and your thigh bones trying to spin out, stay with that. That's great for today. If you want to add one more thing on, you try to squeeze the legs in, keeping the groins back. Hopefully you'll start to feel your inner thighs activate as well, okay? And this is where it's tricky. The anterior tilt muscles plus the squeezing in is your internal rotators, okay? Your anterior tilt muscles, TFL, hip flexors, plus your squeezing of your legs in, adductors, so your outer hips plus inner thighs are your internal rotators. But we're trying to spiral the thigh bones outward, so we're contrasting those actions. You don't have to think externally rotate, internally rotate. Just do the actions I say, which is anterior tilt of your pelvis, squeeze your shins toward each other, and turn the thighs out. And if you do those things, you will be doing both actions. Your hips will just be lit up on fire, okay? Rise up. You're probably shaking, you're probably tired. I am. The important thing is to be able to coordinate these actions, and if so, you're gonna start to gain control of movements of your pelvis versus movements of your thighs inside the hip joints. And as a result, the increased strength and access to these muscles is ultimately what's gonna give you access to more postures like Samokonasana. Turn the legs in, slight internal rotation of the thighs. Imagine the block is, you got a big block between your legs now. Squeeze the block in and spin the upper inner groins back. And that's going to start to tip your pelvis forward.
Come onto your fingertips. Now, on your fingertips, try not to overdo this, but subtly start to lift your sit bones up and just notice if you get any pulling sensation that's not good. Like if you feel like that's a strain, then stop doing that. So subtly lift your sit bones up. Now squeeze your feet down into the ground and toward one another. And if you did feel any pulling, that probably just ceased to exist because you activated the muscles and gave them some integrity. Okay, now as you press your feet down and pull them toward each other, you're gonna subtly start to lift your sit bones and drop your chest a little bit by bending your elbows, but pause. Okay, this is the actions we gotta work on today is not, first of all, mental action, patience, not going all the way forward, all the way like right when you can. Press your feet down and pull them toward each other and slide the inner, you might lift your heels up a little bit, slide the inner thighs back slightly to bend the elbows some more. Pause. Don't go to your fullest extent. Press your feet down. A small micro bend in the knees is fine. Pull your feet toward each other. And without collapsing your knees, spiral the upper thighs in and back. Hamstrings away from one another. Even if you have to lift your heels a little bit, hamstrings go back and that will tip you forward a little bit more. Press your outer edges of your feet down and draw them toward one another. Your inner thighs should be shaking at this point. Inner groins go back, hamstrings apart. Bend the elbows a little bit more and melt. Press your outer feet down and squeeze them toward one another. Now, can you think about your thighs? This is really more of a thought. Just think about your thighs rotating outward at the same time your pubic bone going back between your legs. So think about turning your thighs outward while your upper inner groins go inward. It's contrasting actions, not saying any movements really trying to happen, just you'll feel some subtle space happen in the hip joints if you're trying to both internally and externally rotate the legs. I think about my glutes, my buttocks kind of tucking, my outer hips rotating outward, but my inner thighs rotating inward. Okay, come on out. Walk your hands to the front of the mat. Step forward, and let's take a moment. Squeeze the outer ankles in and sit onto your feet. Squeeze the outer ankles in. Okay, give the ankles a break just in case you're overstraining them at all. And here's a good time to just kind of assess, if you sit up with closed eyes, to assess the hips that you just did a massive opening for. And essentially we did all the actions we're going to be doing while seated, we did while standing, so with the assistance of gravity. In some ways, gravity makes things a little bit harder on us in life, and sometimes it can make things easier. For example, it keeps us on the ground. But in the yoga practice, you can feel it. A lot of times it makes life challenging, but especially for the physical body. But when we use gravity to our advantage, at times it can help us to align our bones properly if we decide to activate certain muscles. So what that should, or what I have better said is, what I hope that has done for us is set the thigh bones a little bit further back in the hip sockets, giving us more joint congruency, which means more potential movement because there's more space. Okay, so the next thing I'd like us to do is Virasana, which is completely contradictory to what you would think. I think it's very helpful because it gets our femur heads back. So what you can do is take a block and place it underneath your hips and turn your thighs inward. Now, one thing we can do is place a block between the legs and squeeze the block
with the fronts of the legs, and then kind of pull the buttocks back. As you squeeze the front of the block inward, you're starting the initiation of internal rotation. You're very internally rotated here, of course. This is an internally rotated position. Okay, but what you can do, some of you might be able to fathom this, the tops of the legs, the tops of the thighs, squeeze the block inward. And if you've been practicing with me for a while, you might be able to get this next part. Keep the tops of the thighs squeezing into the block, but subtly start to move the back of the pelvis apart. Move the hamstrings away from one another. Like you're doing Uttanasana forward fold, move the backs of the legs apart while the fronts of the legs squeeze into the block. Okay, and let's come on out. And please, just for the sake of time, we'll just go right to down dog. Now, I'd like in your down dog to feel like you're in Virasana still. Spin the thighs back. Think about internal rotation of the femur heads. Hamstrings apart. All right, let's take the right leg to the sky on the inhale. And step right foot forward. Pivot the back heel down. Now walk your hands back. I'm going to suggest, highly recommend, a block underneath your right hand, okay? The block underneath your right hand, the hand is back behind the heel. Turn the back toes in and start to, from your right buttocks, press down into your right heel. Try not to jam the knee down towards the ground. That's not the trajectory. But instead, your right sit bone presses the heel diagonally so that your hips start to move back. Now, if you're really, I suggest, try this. Push your feet apart from your heels. Your left heel, the back toes are turned in, pressing out, the front heel pressing out. Just try that and see if that does something for you. And then some of you might be able to add on an idea, and that is to press the front foot straight down into the ground and then drag it towards the back foot. So think about the front of the foot pressing down, like the whole front from all the way through your hip, like press the foot down and drag it towards the back foot gently. And what you might get is your hamstrings start to ignite as well. The center of the hamstrings. Okay, it's hard to do all these actions, so I acknowledge that you're not going to get them all, especially in one class. But step one, if you're like, I don't know what I'm doing, you just from your right sit bone diagonally push the floor down and away, and that should give you enough lightness where it feels easeful on the upper body. Okay. Step two is to press the foot down and drag it towards the back foot. And that might either be in place of action one at first, or it might be in addition to action one, because they're actually both hamstring engagements. They're just different mental imagery for those engagements. And trajectories are a little bit different, but still hamstring activation. Okay? Bend the right knee, left knee down. You're just gonna swap the block on the other side, or just have it ready and come to downward facing dog. Now is a good time to just acknowledge the hips after that Trikonasana variation. Let's take the left leg to the sky. Step left foot forward. Turn the back heel down. Toes are facing slightly forward in the back foot. And again, I'm really going to recommend hand on block. It's going to make your life a lot easier. Step one is to push the mat down and forward, and that should push your weight into your back leg, but try not to let it jam your knee down. In fact, spin the front thigh outward a little bit, and that should give you, especially right, like kind of where the knee is,
just a little rotation outward should give you some space so you're not jamming the knee back. But the trajectory should be from your left buttocks here, pressing through on a diagonal, the same diagonal as your leg, pressing through the front foot. Now, as a result, your back heel is pushing the mat apart as well. And because the back foot is turned in a little bit, it should result in an activation of your abductors of the top leg. So your outer hip of your top leg is active because it's trying to internally rotate. If you push your heel back while your foot is turned in, your back leg is internally rotated. Hopefully you got those of you that are in the teacher trainings and kind of picking up on the anatomy here. The front foot, yes, pushing down and forward, but now if you want to add on or even just replace an action, so don't worry if you can't do, like if you're doing all these mental acrobatics here, don't worry about it so much yet. You can press the top of your foot down like you're trying to push the mat into the floor. Now when I say that, a lot of people push their knee down. Make the lever from your hip, not your knee. So from all the way at the hip, press your foot down into the floor, and then gently start, as you push it down into the floor, drag it gently towards the back foot. But again, if your knee starts to be the joint that moves, just keep your knee still in a micro bend or whatever you want to do so that your knee is not taking any sort of pressure or even like any torque at all. It's just from your hip joint, press solidly down into your left foot like you're trying to smush the mat into the ground, not your knee down towards the ground, but the foot. And now if you do that with a little bend in the knee, and you can really stomp the foot down with a micro bend in the knee, your left hamstrings here are gonna ignite. I didn't mention, but pull your right shoulder back while doing all that if possible, and you're gonna feel some interesting, lovely sensations happening in the left hip. Okay, bend the left knee, place your right knee down. Should be pretty good for the triangle variation. And I think let's come to the ground and we're gonna start on our straddle awareness. Let's come to Janu Shirshasana preparation. And what I mean by that is you try to take your right heel in towards your groin and your left leg out to the side. This is half Samakhanasana. It's Janu Shirshasana preparation. But we're going to really mostly worry about one leg, the left leg. We'll still use the right. But first, what I'd like you to do is bend your left knee and lift your hips up. It's great. In fact, I'm going to do it. You place your hips up on something like a blanket so you aren't having to work too hard in the back muscles. They're going to work hard enough already. Now, like you kind of did in triangle pose, without jamming your knee to the ground, press your heel down into the ground and actually turn your toes out a little bit. What that's going to initiate is a slight internal rotation at the hip. Bear with me now. It's a lot of verbal cues. We realize that, and it's hard to follow. Hopefully from the previous class, it'll be slightly easier. Foot turns out, press heel down, knee slightly bent. And as a result, your hamstrings might ignite. That's really all the prep. Now, here's where it gets a little bit more challenging. Push your right knee and foot outward in order to, that's like when you did in Uttanasana, you press the backs of your legs apart. That's what you're gonna do right now. Push the legs apart like this in order to tip your pelvis forward more, okay? So the backs of the legs apart is gonna help anterior tilt the pelvis. Now, as you do that, your left thigh is gonna wanna roll in. This is where it requires mental discipline to keep the external rotators of this left leg active. If you don't wanna know the muscles, I don't blame you. Just keep your kneecap straight up to the sky, your toes straight up to the sky, push your legs apart, and tip your pelvis forward without changing the angle of your thigh bone. Knee and toes face the sky, flexed foot. Now, if you like, you can start slowly to straighten the left leg, and you'll feel that stretch along the adductor muscles here, okay? You don't wanna strain, so what I do is I'm thinking about
let's see, what would be, yeah, I'm thinking about vacuuming my left femur head, my left thigh bone into the hip socket, and that turns my adductors on so that they're not overstretching. I pull my femur bone, my thigh bone into the hip socket, which is exact opposite of what I said to bow forward. I said to bow forward, press your legs apart. Then when you start to feel that stretch, pull your thigh bone back into the hip socket, activating your hamstrings and adductors while you're holding here. Okay, come on up. Now again, I know this is a lot of verbal cues. It's very technical. If you catch one or two, this is great. And then over time, if you repeat this video, it'll get more and more accessible. And then of course, those of you that have been practicing these cues aren't so foreign to you, then they might be more accessible. All right, so we stand in this half variation, and step one, micro bend your right knee and press the heel down as if you're trying to push the ground down, kind of like you did in triangle pose. Push the ground down and drag it towards you, and that'll ignite your hamstrings underneath here. Okay, that's good to start. And pull the pinky toe side of the foot back. Kneecap straight up to the sky. I'm gonna try to simplify it on this side, so less anatomy, okay? Hopefully your anatomy geeks will have gotten some of this down. Kneecap and toes to the sky. Now, the next thing, after we've pressed down for a while and we've gotten these hamstrings lit up, and timing is everything. We wanna hold certain things in order to get the muscle fatigue active and for the body to feel ready and like, okay, let's go into it. So now, after you've held that for a little while, you can start to push your legs apart, including your left knee, push it apart. And as you push it apart, think about the block between your legs. Push your block back, your groins go back, and you tip your pelvis forward. Now at this point, you might start to feel a strain or overstretch in the hamstrings or adductors. That means you've gone too far and you want to back off a little bit. Now if you feel a nice stretch, but it's not a strain, then you can hang here for a second and drag your femur head back into the hip socket like you're trying to pull your thigh bones into the groin area. That's gonna be your hamstrings, your adductors, and your hip flexors all kind of activating to suck the thigh bone. And that actually gives me more space to tip forward because I'm no longer overstretching. You might feel the opposite because of that strength might be hard to to move against. That's okay too. Now, if and only if you start to feel the stretch sensation goes away, which usually takes at least a few breaths, then you can gently start to move back into pushing the legs outward away from one another, and then thinking inner groins gently go back. At that point, I start to feel a little stretch, maybe a little too deep in the hamstring adductor area. So I go back to pulling my hip flexors, my thigh bones back into the hip sockets and trying to suction like a vacuum into the hip, my thigh bones pulling back inward. It's adductor muscles, so squeezing the legs toward each other. It's hamstrings by pressing the leg down and pulling it back. It's hip flexors by pulling the top of the thigh bone into the hip. So everything pulls the femur head back into the hip socket, and that creates an integrity in the muscular system. And also, while I'm doing all that, those muscles are also tipping my pelvis further forward, so I'm increasing length and stretch. Okay, come on out of that. More or less, that should prepare us properly. So let's do Samokonasana. Let's change the angle here. Again, I suggest the blanket is, or I'm just using a bath towel is totally cool. Some of you that might hinder, might put too much pressure in certain areas, but for majority of people, that's going to be great. Now, how wide should you go? For me, I try to go about 70% of what my actual width is. And I go to a point where if I can sit in a straddle position upright, could be on a blanket, And I don't really feel much of a stretch. I feel maybe just a subtle sensation of stretch in the inner thighs and hamstrings, okay? Now, the basic understanding is toes and knees up to the sky. Keeping that, start to move your inner groins down to the ground. So pubic bone starts to move down to the ground. Let's apply the same actions. First, micro bend the knees and press your heels down into the earth like you're trying to smush the ground down further, and that should get your hamstrings ignited. Holding that for a few breaths to tire out the hamstring muscles can be super, it can be very helpful for the next step. Even if you just completely let it go afterwards, it's gonna be helpful just to sustain that for a little bit. So I'm pressing the legs down, a little micro bend in the knees so that I'm making sure that I'm not confusing the trajectory from the hip. I'm pressing the heels down, which I guess can be confusing too, but ultimately I'm trying not to put the pressure into the knee as much. Okay, then release the knees. Push outward now. Again, that's why we didn't go to our fullest extent. Push outward, and as you do so, look at your knees and make sure they don't roll in. That's why I like to turn the toes a little bit, turn the toes out, and it's gonna feel like you're turning your legs out, but actually you're keeping your legs where they are and pressing the legs apart to turn the pelvis into more anterior tilt. Now I would hold here because now I'm feeling personally, now I feel the stretch in my adductor muscles. So what do I do once I feel a stretch in my adductor muscles? I start to draw two ideas. I can press the heels down and think about micro tucking my tailbone, or I can suction the thigh bones into the hip sockets. Woo! Now that TFL that we talked about earlier can really start to ignite, and it pulls my hips forward more. But now I'm trying to pull my feet toward each other, which is very confusing. You can kind of see my yoga mat is starting to scrunch up over here because I'm dragging the feet inward to the midline. Not so much that I'm gonna strain anything, but enough that I am feeling like I could actually, I'll show you, lift my hands up without really freaking out because my legs are pressing down and drawing in. Okay, there's some power there where I'm not just falling into my hands, okay? Where there's some strength here. Now, a lot of people, if they lift their hands up, they wouldn't be strong enough to do that, and as a result, it would overstretch because they'd fall forward, so I don't suggest doing it. Okay, now, pause. Assess where you're at. My suggestion is you can do one of two things. If you want to continue bowing forward, is to return back to pressing the legs apart, okay? Otherwise, and groins back, you're trying to hollow out, you could, if you want, start to transition with your hips forward more, increasing or decreasing the angle, I suppose, to be more a same angle pose, okay? Now I feel a deeper stretch in the adductors here. I'm gonna press the legs down for a moment, activate them, and I said it in the email to us that it really requires patience. It requires a tremendous amount of patience to get into this pose properly. And the body, it's an extreme posture, so you don't want to put it too, through too much of the ringer. You wanna go there slowly and respect it, okay? And then the same idea, I'm feeling like I'm towards my end range here, so I'm not gonna go much further. I'm just gonna start to keep my legs suctioning inward. But you could press depending on where you are in your range, you could press your legs outward and move the groins back like we did in side angle, pubic bone back. All right. And to come out, I like to use my hands. Woosa. Woo, daddy. That releases all sorts of endorphins for me. I'm not sure for you, but all right. Fun stuff. I got the giggles right now. So essentially the idea is this push and pull action. It's a back and forth of pushing out to increase mobility, but you got to be careful with that because it can really go, too much too soon, so it's very subtle. Then squeezing back in, and all the while your knees are staying straight up no matter how much your pelvis tilts forward. And that is external rotation. But tipping the pelvis forward, squeezing in, these are so it's a combination of internal and external rotators. Your sentiments exactly. All right. We're gonna wind down. We're much over time, I apologize. So let's just come onto our back and let's let the knees come together perhaps maybe today. Let's do some slow, steady breaths through the nose. Two more steady breaths through the nose. And as you're ready, release into any variation of Shavasana you'd like.
awareness back to your breath. Stretch your arms. Roll to your side. And then come up to a seated position. Let's place the palms together at heart center. Bowing in honor of this body and the adventure that we get to take that we call yoga. Thanks to everybody that's passed this down, and thanks to all of you for being here so we can share this experience together. Namaste. All right, I saw a quick question in the chat I wanted to address, and that is the back neutral or is it arching in this posture? So the low back muscles are what creates the anterior tilt of the pelvis, along with the hip flexors as well, and even the adductors can help. So activating your adductors and your hip flexors can help to anterior tilt the pelvis, but those muscles are kind of working hard already and are already stretched out, so your back muscles help. So think about arching your low back in short when you're doing this pose, but it doesn't mean that your back is necessarily arched. If your chest is upright like so, then yes, your back is arched. The more you fold forward, you're gonna still try to keep your back muscles active because that's what's gonna tip your pelvis forward. Eventually, depending on your intentions, you might round the back on purpose, or it will round out because your pelvis won't tip any further. Okay, hopefully that answers the question. Loving the tip of pulling the femur head in. It really works so well. I'm so glad to hear that. Sometimes it lands for some people, and other times it's just too esoteric. But for me, it's really a great experience if you can get that. He said, "Woo, daddy." I did. Kristen says, shaking in unfamiliar hip places. I'm so happy to do these stretches with no strain to the hamstring attachment. I'm so happy to hear that. Thanks so much, Matt. Have a great day. Everything. Thank you, Marissa. Nice to see you. Sabui says, agreed with Aoife. Love the cue. Thanks so much. Glad to hear that, Sabui. Patrick says, great to be with you all. Thanks so much, Matt. Thanks, Patrick. Nice to have you here. Nina G, love, 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 thank you. Love you too, wonderful. Happy that you enjoyed it. Michelle says, amazing class, thank you. I had some pain in the front of my knee, inside angle, okay, when I did anterior tilt of my pelvis. It got a bit better. Could you speak on that to explain a bit for me? So the front of your knee, inside angle, can you just clarify by this? I would consider this to be the front where the patella is, the kneecap and the patella tendon here. Is that what you mean? Or do you mean kind of inside of the knee? Because that's going to make a big difference when you did anterior tilt. My guess is you probably felt it on the inside, but if you felt it at the front, I'm not sure how anterior tilt inside angle would affect the front of the knee, because that's really quadriceps pulling on the patella. The anterior tilt, I think, could affect the adductors more likely, causing some inner knee pain. But please verify. Michelle.
Patty said, great class, Matt. Thank you. Have a nice day, everyone. You too, Patty. Simona says, what are your thoughts on the straddle fold approach versus getting into it from wide-legged forward fold with the toes and knees pointing forward? Oh, that's a bit more extreme. And the difference really is if your legs are turned in, Simona, it's going to be like, that's what it is. It's with, basically that's the pose I just taught with internally rotated thigh bones and inverted ankle joints. That's all that is. But really the main difference for the hips is the internally rotated thigh bones versus externally rotated thigh bones. The major difference is, are you stretching your hamstrings and your adductors, or are you just stretching your adductors? With internally rotated thighs, more of that like kind of pancake style stretch is going to be just adductors. But it requires, of course, some flexibility of the outer ankles as well to get into that variation. Thoughts? It's just two different experiences. Completely. Tara says, thanks so much, Matt. So many great cues. Love all the action cues and triangle pose. Cool. Uta says, great. Thank you, Matt. Thanks, Uta. Ani says, have a great rest of your day. To everyone. Thanks, Ani. Petty says, thanks so much for a wonderful class. Have a nice evening. You too, Petty. Lenore says, yes, love the idea of adducting to protect the hamstrings. Great practice, thanks. Absolutely. Yeah, just under the kneecap. Okay. Shell, not really certain how the tilt of the pelvis directly would affect. There must be something indirectly that would be causing, if you're doing more anterior tilt inside angle. I guess my question would be, Michelle, do you feel that same pain if you did like a lizard variation like this? So this is Warrior 2 with elbows bent out to the side. Do you feel that pain there? Or is it only here? I'm just trying to see what would cause that knee pain. Unless there's some sort of twisting going on. Is your kneecap facing straight forward? Or maybe you're not pressing into your heel. Okay, that's my suggestion. Okay, if maybe you're overloading your quadriceps in that position, that's my best guess, is that what you're doing is you're pressing more towards the front of the foot, and because of the anterior tilt, you're going down further, the weight of your body is heavier, so what you're doing is probably overloading your quads, and your quads are maybe pulling on that too strongly more than you're used to. So you have to activate your glute muscles, your buttock muscles, Michelle, by pressing down into the heel. Think about coming out of the pose like you're going to try to stand up. A little activation like you're going to tuck your tailbone, that idea, and push into your heel until you feel your buttocks fire up, and tell me if that does it for you to release some of the tension. Okay, Pat says, wow, great. So sorry I went to the bathroom when you addressed the completed class thing. Could sort of hear. Could you repeat Pat, I'm not certain. So sorry I went to the bathroom when you addressed the completed. I think just rewind it, Pat. Okay, Catherine felt sacroiliac on the left side as soon as I released that big pose. Is there a way to protect that more? Yes, it's a common flare up for you. Okay, cool. Catherine, so when you come out of a pose, first of all, if you've got like an injury like that or something where you're prone to instabilities or something, any kind of injury, when you come out of a pose, come out as active as you came in. So I kind of came out like as I released it and relaxed. But if I had like that kind of instability in the sacrum, I would come out and back out incrementally. So it's not like a slingshot where the body just comes, like that could be okay if you don't have any instabilities in your joints. It's totally fine to come out that way because that rubber band effect, your joints are gonna be okay. But if you've got some instabilities, then what I recommend is you come out slowly, still kind of pulling your legs toward each other, and as slowly as we came in, you can back out. And also don't go to that extreme, especially if you've got a sacral issue, because it could start tilting the ilium. It doesn't mean it will tilt your ilium, but it might start tilting your ilium one way or another if you're going more deeply on your flexible side and not deep on your tight side. On the flip side, it can be really good for your sacroiliac joint. Just so I cover my bases here, the sacrum exists between the two sides of the ilium. So the pelvis rotationally forward, back. What most of us will do is we'll anterior tilt more on the side that we're flexible on and posterior tilt on the side that we're less flexible on. If you reverse that, if you don't go as deep on the side that you're flexible on, and you go a little bit deeper on the side that you're tighter on, that could help realign the pelvis so that you're not getting it caught in your patterns. It's such a hard explanation, but there's two sides of the ilium, and they're able to rotate posterior and anterior tilt individually because they are separate. And as a consequence, because they're able to move, it's the sacrum that's caught in between where you can start to feel that as a negative thing. And this happens, when we walk and everything. It's part of natural movement, but if you've got some hypermobility, then that can be exacerbated, and then the sacrum's kind of caught in the middle, and it's like doesn't know which way to go because the pelvises are in two different directions. And then also rotationally, the pelvis can kind of the sacrum and the ilium can kind of move in the back and out in the back. So what I suggest right now is maybe doing a chair pose, pressing the backs of the heels apart and trying to get an even amount of anterior tilt and an even amount of pressing the backs of the hamstrings apart to try to kind of pry open the ilium a little bit to let the sacrum come back in if you're still feeling that. Okay. Okay, lizard feels fine. Okay, great. Yeah, so if lizard feels fine, that's probably because you have two hands on the ground now and you're taking less weight in the quadriceps. So I think what I assessed earlier, Michelle, is probably the accurate answer for you. Yeah, Pat, that's okay. If you've got some bursitis going on, to not, go into the full extent of your side angle and things like that in your hips. Thank you for amazing class as usual. The immersion is very challenging for my hips, but I can feel improvements. Awesome, Karina. Nice to hear that. Catherine says, perfect. Thank you. Okay, cool. I'm glad we addressed that. All right, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. I appreciate your questions. Those of you that stayed after, lots of love to you, and be well. Take care of yourself.